Welcome to Season 2, Episode 19 of the podcast, Ghosts, Demons, and Murder, Oh My. My name is Hayden Crook, and I will be your host for today's episode on the Humpty Doo Poltergeist. And thank you to Drew for recommending this topic to me. Like I usually say at the end of my videos lately, and my podcast episodes, I'm taking suggestions. I'll do the research and try and cover it the best I can, but it is hard sometimes to come up with my own content and ideas because like a lot of podcasts have either covered a topic or it's just kind of hard to find content sometimes. So I appreciate suggestions, recommendations. Like I said, you can send those to my email, haydencrook8@gmail.com. I always put my email in the show notes, so feel free to send me your recommendations anytime. I welcome them. So for source one, it's A Week with the Humpty Doo Poltergeist by Paul Cropper and Tony Healy. In 1998, a Northern Territory household claimed they were being terrorized by an unseen entity which displayed all of the traits of a bothersome poltergeist. Paul Cropper and Tony Healy spent a never to be forgotten week in the Humpty Doo house. It began as an ordinary Yowie hunt, but soon turned decidedly weird. In December, we taped a telephone interview with a woman who told us of a close encounter with a screaming, stinking, 7 foot tall orangutan like creature on her Mingle farm near Acacia, Acacia Gap in the Northern Territory. Although the location was thousands of kilometers from the regions which normally produce reports of Yowies, damnably elusive Yeti like ape men, she seemed a very good witness. So when she phoned again in April to say the creature had returned, we decided to don our Yowie hunting hats and fly north. No sooner had we made that decision than a striking instance of synchronicity occurred. At the time, we were working on an article for the 14 Times about a couple of classic Australian poltergeist cases. We were up to those weird old stories when we heard a Father Tom English speak on radio about levitating crucifixes and showers and stones, which he had just witnessed in a house at Humpty Doo, North Territory, only 20 kilometers from the Yowie site. Most fortuitous. Once in the Northern Territory, we documented the Yowie stories planned and collected a footprint cast, but the beast itself, as usual, remained elusive. The plot, however, was much more accessible. For 5 days, it obliged by showering us with pebbles, knives, bullets, and anything else which came into its ectoplasmic grasp. The haunting was focused on a four-bedroom house set on 5 acres just south of Humpty Doo, beginning in late January 1998. By the time we arrived on April 26th, it had become Australia's most publicized Pult case since the Guyra ghost outbreak of 1921. When Jill Somerville, her partner Dave Clark, and their mate Murph moved into the house in August 1997, they noticed they noticed nothing strange. But after a second couple, Andrew and Christy Aegis arrived with their 11-month-old toddler Jasmine, all hell broke loose. During that monsoon season, the area witnessed several of the loudest, wildest lightning displays anyone can remember. After one such rip snorter, the group was sitting on their front veranda at dusk when small pebbles began landing among them. Tiring of what they assumed was their mate's practical joke, they moved inside only to have the pebbles follow them in classic Pulp style showers of half-inch diameter stones, all apparently from their long gravel driveway landed on floors, tables, beds, and heads after materializing just under the ceiling. Though the property was entirely saturated from the monsoon, all the pebbles that fell inside were bone dry. To their increasing dismay, knives, batteries, spanners, broken glass, and other objects also began to drop or hurtle across the rooms. To the occupants, very tough, hardworking young men and women, all this was weird but bearable. But when messages began to appear on the walls and the floor, the group began to get a little nervous. The words were spelt out in Scrabble tiles, scrawled on floors, or formed extremely neatly using scores of pebbles. The most upsetting aspect of the first series of words, fire, skin, car, help, and Troy, was that they clearly referred to their good mate Troy, who had been incinerated in a road accident in January. A large cross and trident, both made up of hundreds of pebbles, also appeared. Fairly freaked, they called the clergy Father Tom English of Humpty Doo. who arrived at the scene to be greeted by a pistol cartridge, which fell from nowhere to land at his feet, and by a medicine bottle flying out of an empty room. Although inexperienced in such matters, he gamely blessed the place and doused it in holy water. The Polt reacted in time honored way. It went ape shit. Smashed several windows, hurled Father Tom's crucifix and Bible around the house, banged and scraped on and inside walls, and kept the occupants awake and thoroughly spooked all night. Two other priests tried to hop the Polt. Father Stephen of Darwin, St. Mary's Cathedral, had seen several similar infestations in his native India. After witnessing a knife fall, apparently straight through the ceiling, he warned that Polts are often very hard to exorcise. A Greek Orthodox priest went to the full Monty, setting up an altar on the kitchen table, blessing each room and reading arcane passages from a large black book. As the shell shocked residents looked on, he was assaulted by an invisible force that repeatedly tried to wrench the book from his grasp and to twist his right arm behind his back. Ashen faced, he finally sat down, declaring his adversary to be tougher than the average spook. The local Litchfield Times was soon tipped off. Its editor, Jack Ellis, and two reporters visited the house, observed a Polt pelting, and in no time the story went ballistic. The sleep deprived Haunties were soon fielding phone calls day and night from radio stations and newspapers from as far away as Scandinavia. They soon signed a contract granting exclusive rights to the story for a week to Sydney's Channel 7. Although the promised 5,000 would be most welcome, they signed mainly in the expectation of being protected from other media harassment and the hope that video evidence would validate their story. Although the entire TV crew quickly became fervent believers after dodging flying objects, they also became frustrated as the Polt took to playing hide and seek with their cameras. Operators with handheld cameras were invariably facing the wrong way when objects landed right next to them. With the house empty and locked, 5 constantly running fixed cameras recorded a whole lot of nothing until the battery expired signals went off. Then, as the duty cameraman walked to the house with new batteries, his exasperated but amused mates drinking on the patio would hear a tattoo of wax as objects careened around the interior. Messages: no cameras, no TV, and pig camera appeared on walls and floors to taunt them. After 24-hour workdays and great inconvenience to the residents, the crew managed to record only 3 objects in motion: a baby's bottle inexplicably falling from the top of a microwave, a pistol bullet in the last foot or so of its fall, and a plastic lid flying from behind a cupboard. Channel 7's Tonight, one of the country's least ethical tabloid television shows, nevertheless, used the story to great advantage, achieving very high ratings. Finally, to the horror of the Haunties and to the dismay of their own cameramen, the program's skeptical city based producers, having owned the story for a week, decided to scuttle it. Using a doctored video with misleading voiceovers, they attempted to prove they had caught Christie in the act of throwing an object. The Polt story, they declared, was over, dead. The Polt, however, seemed not to have heard its own obituary. It continued its pesky pranks while the tenants, feeling used, abused, and betrayed, and still awaiting the balance of their money, vowed to disembowel any other fucking media vultures who dared to darken their door. At that auspicious moment, Healy and Cropper arrived. We were received by 2 very tough-looking, unsmiling hombres. Shaven-headed Andrew, guarded but polite, glowering, heavily tattooed biker. Murph didn't bother to hide his disdain for used media bastards. Fortunately, we had with us our material on earlier Aussie Polt cases. As they eagerly scanned it, finding many similarities to their own experience, and as they realized we were genuinely interested, they began to lower the barriers. After Dave and Jill, both quiet and easygoing, and the more intense but friendly Kirsty arrived, things became even more relaxed, and we were invited to stay the night. Far from being a bunch of drunken layabouts, as some of the media tried to portray them, the residents struck us as being strong minded, competent people. It was clear that above all else, they simply wanted to be believed. While it didn't take long to convince us, nothing happened as we slept on the lounge room floor that night, except for a sudden staccato cry from a gecko, which resulted in Paul having to carefully peel Tony off the ceiling. But during the next 5 days, often with only Kirsty in the house, about 30 objects fell on or about us. Usually we heard a sharp whack as a missile hit and then caught sight of it as it ricocheted off a wall or settled on the floor. Most of the objects were familiar household items, but some, like a yellow light bulb which fell beside us on the concrete patio without breaking, had not been seen before. We gathered the material and stashed it in a drawer on the patio, only to have the items appear one by one back inside the house. After some of the episodes, we found Dave and Jill's bedroom trashed, the mattress askew and sometimes gravel strewn about. On one occasion, Paul heard a rattling sound on the tin roof. An instant before, 13 pebbles landed on the kitchen floor beside him, having apparently teleported through both roof and ceiling. Stones later fell on his head, and a shining knife narrowly missed Tony's ear. The more we saw, the more we understood the residents' fury at the smug, ill informed skeptics who offered patently unfeasible explanations on the press from their homes in Darwin or Sydney. One such idiot seriously suggested that the group, with an 11-month-old toddler in the house, placed gravel sharp knives and broken glass on top of their ceiling fans so the material would fly out in all directions at the flick of a switch. Many of the incidents could, if one or more of the residents had been skilled conjurers, have been faked, but several, such as when a pistol cartridge dropped vertically onto Paul's leg as we sat facing the only other people in the room, seem almost unfakeable. Two incidents in particular were very convincing. A small crucifix left at the house after Father Tom became a frequent flyer. Several times a day, it would disappear from the mantelpiece and later crash into a wall somewhere. When it landed on the rear patio beside Paul, with the only other people 30 meters away and plainly in sight, he became a near total believer. When Tony saw a little brass plug fall vertically onto a table between he and Kirsty, who was holding a newspaper with both hands while reading a pulp story aloud, he too had to admit that a hoax was almost out of the question. It would be natural for skeptics to question the judgment of people like us, people who chase yowies and bunyips, and who, like X Files agent Fox Mulder, obviously want to believe. So I hasten to mention that all six journalists we met who visited the house, also came away firm pulp believers. Territory news reporter Nikki Voss and her cameraman had their extreme skepticism jolted when they were greeted by a beer mug which shot with great force and uncanny accuracy through a very small hole in a window pane. Shortly afterwards, as they stood with their backs to a solid wall, they were hit in the nape of the neck with a shower of gravel. Tracy Farrer of ABC Radio, Darwin, who collected small brown shells at the beach only the day before, watched an identical shell land on the table in front of her as she interviewed Kirsty. She received an inexplicable shock from her microphone and most tellingly saw a remote control unit lift off a table next to her and fly into the air, though thrilled she was, like Nikki Voss, plagued by bad dreams for several nights afterward. Like us, the journalists could not see how all the phenomena could have been faked or why the group would do it. The money from Channel 7 was not significant. The group clearly did not relish the public attention, and the flying objects were potentially dangerous, particularly to the toddler. A hoaxing individual or clique within the group would have risked murder by the others if discovered. We don't believe hoaxers were at work, but if they were not only first rate conjurers, but first class actors as well. The origin of the Humpty Doo Pole is unclear. Stavros Canaris, who built the place in 1972 and lived there happily for 20 years, thinks the pole is a result of his family's anger at being evicted after his business failed. The bank took my blood, 30 years of hard work, the family still dreaming of returning. Every night I'm there in my dreams. My wife is always there too. It was our life. As she was forced from their home on the last day, Maria Canaris did not curse the beloved house. She did, however, put a heartfelt curse on the bank. Although moved by the story, it occurred to us that if a bolt appeared every time someone cursed a bank, then every home would have one. Irene Winters, who cleaned the house before the group moved in, recalled that it seemed spooky, unnaturally cold, and the doors seemed to open and close of their own volition. Andrew, however, thinks the Pult in a weaker form may have followed he and Kirsty for some time. 2 years earlier at Bachelor, North Territory, they'd had stones thrown with great power and accuracy through their front door. Although they assumed their assailants were black teenagers reacting to Andrew's unconcealed anti-Aboriginal views, they never so much as glimpsed them. Later, when he and Kirsty working at a construction camp, coffee cups and other objects were missing in odd circumstances. Everyone seemed to agree that the great Humpty Doo weirdness began only when they moved in. Having been told by a learned friend that Aboriginal clever men or sorcerers have sometimes plagued their enemies with showers of stones, we wondered if Andrew and Kirsty had been cursed in that manner. An incident that occurred a few days before we arrived seemed to hint that such was the case. Kirsty at home alone noticed two very dark bush aborigines digging a hole next to the house, which is 70 meters from the road. When challenged, they walked silently away. Leaves had been cleared in a 6 by 2 foot patch across the foot deep hole. After that mysterious visit, all pult activity ceased for 4 days, the longest break they had had. Despite all the references to his terrible death, the residents strongly rejected the notion that their mate Troy was haunting them. Having noticed that the Pult attempted to play on some of their fears and concerns, after apparently listening to their conversations, the group threw a challenge right back at its ectoplasmic face. Walking through the house, they shouted such non-Vatican approved invocations as, "You're not Troy, you piss weak bastard. Why don't you just fuck off?" Thereafter, all references to Troy ceased, and the residents, though never relishing it, slowly became used to living with the Pult and at times even deliberately provoked it into tantrums. Andrew successfully stirred it up for us a couple times by reading out Psalms from Father Tom's Bible. We admired the group for the way they refused to be driven from the house, which, with its spacious grounds, large garage, and poolside bar, suited them perfectly at the time. Finally, however, in early May, after surviving the onslaught of the Pult, the scrutiny of the nation, and a curious, unjustified eviction attempt from their landlord, they walked away on their own terms, leaving the house and hopefully the Pult behind them. The Humpty Doo case seemed to have almost everything we have come to expect from a major Pult outbreak: showers of stones, rappings and scratchings, dangerous objects thrown with great force but without causing injury, threatening messages, mind games, violent reactions to prayers, and religious paraphernalia, resistance to exorcism, ill-informed pronouncements by skeptics, and a half-arsed, contrived expose of supposed hoaxing. This is the suggestion that a cursed Greek, Aboriginal, or otherwise is capable of conjuring up a Pult is not entirely without precedent. In 1982, South African teenagers were reportedly plagued by stonefalls after annoying a witch doctor. But two things observed at Humpty Doo have, we believe, not been recorded elsewhere. After a wild night in February, which left a thick covering of pebbles on their car roofs and outdoor bar, the residents noticed long, shallow troughs in their gravel driveway, as though the pebbles had been vacuumed up in their thousands. Shortly afterwards, Brett Stiles, a maid of Murph's, may have caught a unique glimpse of a Pult reloading. One evening, he observed a strange object flying from the driveway under the patio roof and away at tremendous speed. It appeared to be spherical, jet black, and smaller than fist size, and it had a 2 foot long stream of gravel behind it. Freaky. Let's see. And then this next article is just um think like it's like um contemplating like if it was faked and that kind of stuff. They kind of go more into it. And it's the 14 via Cropster. He talked a little bit more about the Humpty Doo case, so I was going to read that for my second source. Humpty Doo, one of the best documented poltergeist cases of all time, began 20 years ago this month. The Cropster was one of at least 30 witnesses to the strange happenings that took place in the small blue house in the McMinns Drive, Humpty Doo, in Australia's Northern Territory. Humpty Doo is an Australian slang term meaning everything is topsy turvy or turned upside down, a perfect description of what poltergeists do. Um, okay, and then I already went over the story from Cropster and Healy in that last source. So Cropster says the most common question I get asked is, was it real? Yes, it certainly was. I remained I remain convinced that what I observed over 4 days in April 1998 was a poltergeist. 20 years later, I'm no closer to understanding what a poltergeist is, even after investigating causes in Australia, Turkey, Malaysia, Vietnam, and Zimbabwe. Guy Playfair once mentioned to me that after decades of investigating cases, he was still none the wiser as to what they must be, or they might be. Poltergeists are probably the most accessible and yet the most puzzling of all paranormal phenomena. The second most common question I'm asked is, were you scared? Well, I don't recollect being scared until after I arrived back home in Sydney. Then every unexpected noise in my apartment made me spontaneously levitate. I clearly remember how strange, intense, and exciting the whole experience was. It was like watching a great magician, you see. Or you were seeing things that you couldn't explain, but you wanted to see more so you could work out the trick. But we never did work it out. At Humpty Doo, there wasn't a trick. Tony and I had been working on an article on historical poltergeist for 14 times when we heard about the case and ended up in Darwin. And then it talks about like the TV show that called them out and said they were hoax. That particular episode still remains controversial. And then he, let's see, at the end, oh yeah, all the residents move out. They had enough of the poltergeist, the meeting, everything. A few of my experiences at the house still puzzle me 20 years later. The first occurred as I was sitting at a table facing two of the female residents. As they washed up at the kitchen sink only a few feet away, they were still talking when I heard two sounds. The first, a handful of gravel stones from their driveway hitting the corrugated tin roof of the house, and then the kitchen floor where they were scattered. Two loud, distinct, and separate sounds. Neither of the women had thrown anything, and the stones had fallen behind me and where the girls were standing. It appeared that the stones had come through both the roof and the plaster ceiling. While the ceiling fan in the kitchen was switched on, the stones had dropped straight down and not scattered until after they hit the floor, so it was clearly not the source. Similar rains of gravel took place throughout the house during our investigation. Some of these occurred when the fans were switched off, and others took place in rooms without ceiling fans. The next truly puzzling episode was when Tony, Andrew, and Kirsty, two of the residents, and I were sitting at a small round table in the main room. I was seated a small distance out from the table edge when an empty bullet casing bounced off my knee and onto the floor. The contact was strangely soft given the metal of the bullet casing. Andrew said he had never, or Andrew said he had seen the object materialize above my shoulder and then fall. No one at the table had moved or thrown anything. The weirdest incident of all was when a slow, steady rain of tiny gravel stones fell on my head one morning as I sat alone at the same table. They seemed to drop slowly from the ceiling right above me. Blink, blink, blink. The stones weren't tossed from outside the room. If the TV people were right and the whole situation was a setup, then why continue the show just for Tony and I over the last few days before everyone left the house? We weren't reporters and there was no money or publicity involved. Yet the activity continued for the whole time we were there. At least 37 incidents, according to my notes. Tricky stuff, too, like the shower of gravel I saw in the kitchen and the slow drizzle of stones on my noggin. Another intriguing aspect to the Humpty haunting was the fact that the TV crew had engaged a thermal camera operator, Brendan Gowdy, to join them in the house. The plan was that Gowdy would use his camera to identify evidence of human contact on the objects being thrown about. As an example of how that works, I've used my own FLIR 1 thermal camera to show how handprints can be identified on an object. The thermal image below shows a small knife on my kitchen bench. Here's the same knife after I picked it up and held it with my hands. As you can see, the heat from my hand has created areas of differential temperature. Okay. And sorry, you guys can't see this, but I can. Um, the image below shows a large shard of glass that Gaudy photographed shortly after the incident. The heat is spread evenly across the glass and then dissipates in less than a minute, as shown by the images below. Brendan later admitted on camera he was baffled. He half heartedly stated that it could be explained if the objects were heated in microwave and then thrown using tongs. Right. Interesting. Um, and then Brendan's involvement in the case in 1998 on the news. The claim that objects thrown by a poltergeist were unusually warm or hot has appeared in many other cases in literature. In the recent Terzo Wilka, Poland incident covered in this blog, one of the witnesses stated, I keep some set of cutlery in the attic for the special occasions, so we took the spoons even from there to throw them at us. And those spoons were so hot they were baked in the oven. Would the residents of the house been aware of the obscure element of the poltergeist literature and then bothered to incorporate it into their hoax? Brendan told Tony and I that the residents were never told he was using a thermal device, so he could more easily catch them out. I assume they thought Brendan was using a normal video camera. I do look back at Humpty Doo with some regret. I wish I had taken more photos and videos. Cameras in the late 90s were film based, not digital, so it wasn't so easy to take lots of shots. I never thought of keeping a tape recorder running continuously. In 1998, we were still using rather expensive cassette tapes. One small segment I did record in the house is a personal favorite. Kirsty, Andrew, Tony, Healy, and I are in the main room talking. You can hear Kirsty in the background saying, "You don't know what it's going to do. It just does what it wants to do." Bang. A knife ricochets off a wall, and everyone talks excitingly. Nobody in the room threw anything. One thing about the Humpty Doo Pult, its timing was perfect. Some readers would still believe the case was a hoax. After all, I had a prosperity to believe, given my interest in the subject. They will say their residents were all in on the game. They set up the ceiling fans to scatter rocks, used sleight of hand, and heated up objects before they threw them. All the other 30 plus witnesses were fooled too. Believe that if it helps you sleep at night. To me, the best explanation of the facts is that for a few months in early 1998, a poltergeist had decided to infest the small blue house in McMinn's Drive, Humpty Doo. Update. After finishing this piece, I was looking through some of the footage taken by the Sydney Current Affairs show at the house when I came across one incident they recorded. Kirsty's talking about the poltergeist. It will just do it when you friggin' least expect it. Bang. A spanner hits a cabinet. Similar excited voices. Kirsty's comments and the pulse reaction were almost identical to the audio I recorded later. Perfect timing indeed. So let me know in the comments if you think it was a hoax or not. I don't think it's a hoax. I don't know, like back in the 90s, like he said, like I don't really think those people would have taken the time to like research different literature and heat that stuff up and throw it. I mean, there was a ton of different people in and out of the house, 30 plus witnesses. So I don't think it's a hoax. I think it's an interesting case. Um, I found some audio and some other stuff from the case on these websites, so I'm going to post that in the show notes so you can listen to that. Let me know what you think below in the comments. Thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoyed today's episode of Ghosts, Demons, and Murder Oh My. Make sure to subscribe to this podcast so you can get all the updates, information, and content that will be uploaded. Thank you for the support and for listening to my podcast. Episode ideas or recommendations are welcome, and as always, I can be reached via email at hiddencrook8@gmail.com.